Hi, everybody. Welcome to my Monday show about government, all levels of government. I find that when I read for people, a lot of things like they know the suits, they know the terms from metaphysical info, they know about their astrologic charts, they know where their planets are, they don't know where their polling place is, they know um, what planets trigger off what things for them. They know tarot suits well enough so that if you throw certain cards, they go, oh, God, oh, no. And it's actually not a bad card. You have to learn to read the cards around it. They know their numerology and they know the master numbers, but they don't understand how people count votes and how they look at that. Um, they know how pendulums swing yes and no, but they don't know where they can go find out if they're yes or no about what a candidate's doing. So I just ran into a couple people in the last couple weeks. The main thing that they seem to not understand is, well, they didn't understand constituent services, which means when you elect a public official to be in a role, you don't send them up there to sit in the mountain and play like they're king. You send them up there to help hustle through the services that their area of government supplies. So, what I'm going to start with is real simple. I'm adding this to the stream. Now, this is the levels of government. In theory, the way our laws are written, and if you read the Constitution, we're at the top. This is us. This is people voting, people, little kids, parents voting to protect their kids, adults voting to protect children. And then the next layer is the federal, and that's over the contiguous 48 states. They didn't put Alaska or Hawaii on here, but they're there for them too. They're also there for our territories, which is Puerto Rico, Guam, American Samoa, and I think I'm forgetting one, but I'm going to go into how they're kind of structured. Then the federal government falls through to the states, and uh, that's that's the whole thing about, are we really structured the way we think we are, or is it a confederation? The For those of you who slept through early American history, we originally had a confederation, but it was so loose and so unwieldy and so impossible that they came back and rewrote the Constitution that we have now. Now, below within the states are counties, which are uh, large areas of land within the state. Texas has the most. It has somewhere over 450. And then within the counties, you can have townships and you can have cities. And cities can also be towns and municipalities and special districts, depending on what's there. So that's how it flows. But if you notice, the majority of the governing and the majority of what touches their lives is down here on the bottom in the county, township, and cities. Um, and so we're gonna look at that for a minute because um, okay, before we're talking now, basically we're talking about the American system here. There are actually 7 systems of okay, there's some different types of governments include direct democracy, which is like, I don't know if they still do it in New England, but they would have meetings where everyone would gather together. That's direct democracy. Then a representative democracy is where you vote for someone to go represent you and help set up the rules for the majority of the people around you. Then you have um, represent you have direct. Let's see. Then you have socialism, which is where the government takes over certain roles for the protection of the people. That's my definition of socialism. You may not find that in a book. Then there's communism, and communism was based on the idea that everybody owned everything, but they elected leaders to make sure that uh, to each their needs and You earn what you can earn with the sweat of your brow, and then you get back what you actually need to survive. That's never proven to be a terribly workable sort of government in actual fact. And then there's the monarchy, which is goes back to the Middle Ages, where they fought their way to the top and held it on, and held it on through family trees. And then there's an oligarchy, which is people who rule because they have the most money. They have the most control because they control the most of the economy. And then you have the autocracy, and that's what you hear them talking about a lot now, where people are trying to get elected into positions to just take power. And what we have, what this, what I'm representing to you in these levels of governments are representative democracies. So I'm going to start with local government. And this is kind of a view of it. What's normally on top of cities is you'll be in some kind of county. I think in Alaska they're called boroughs. In other parts of the country they're called different things. And local governments include two tiers: counties, some also known as boroughs in Alaska, and parishes in New Orleans, in Louisiana. That's the other one I knew was kind of unique, because I came down here and I grew up in the north, where we had counties, and then townships within the counties, and then the towns within the townships. And normally, and the reason I know this is kind of a problem is I used to run candidates running for city council. I've also ran candidates running for county government. But when they're running for city council, they'd show up on someone's doorstep and they'd say, and this was back in the early 2000s, they said, "What do you think of same-sex marriage?" And she's like, "I don't do that. City council doesn't do that. City council does water and streets and police and the basic needs that are closest to you to survive." They also handle registration of births and deaths within their county, which are then usually compiled back into the state. At least in Texas they are. And then they also name roads and streets, and do permits for construction. They do the nuts and bolts of what makes your life work, or in the case of some of us, not work. But those are the guys who do it. They do zoning. Sometimes zone to me was a four-letter word, because our zoning, when I was fighting them, were not particularly good. So they would let anything kind of happen anywhere, which is not a great plan. But in Houston, that is the plan. They don't have designated zoning, or they used to not have designated zoning, which seems like madness to me. But anyway. And also within the city, they have the executive branch, which is kind of the mayor and those people. Then they have, and they pass the laws, but they also handle the judicial. There's city courts, which do speeding tickets and things like that. So when you're in an area that's relatively populous, you find these sort of nice little delineations. In Texas, I'll tell you that the borders of counties were decided because it has to take 1 day to ride into the county seat. So the county seat tends to be right in the centers of the counties. And from any direction, it should take 1 day on a horse to ride in, which tells you a whole lot about when those were designated. But that's how it was happening. And every state has its own peculiarity of how it came up with what it wants to do. Municipalities, when you're looking at a person running for your city council, or whatever you call a city council, city councils and mayors are elected at large. Then they generally work through a city manager. What I have on the screen is what Dallas has. We have a city council, and the mayor presides over the city council, and then the city council appoints the city manager, and then they appoint the people who do police, fire, clerks, public works, sanitation, parks, planning, zoning, all that good stuff. And that sounds like a lovely system, except my feeling living in Dallas is the city council doesn't have can't. You can go to your city council and ask for what are constituent services. You can say they're not fixing the streets in our areas. What do we need to do? And there are things you can do to kind of see how planning's going and motivate them to plan towards you if you have the time and the notion to do that. One of my political mentors was a woman named Valletta Lil, and she was in an area that the city was sort of not paying a lot of attention to on the east side of White Rock Lake. And so she was down at city council so much that she ended up being on city council. I mean, they just said, why don't you run? You're here all the time anyway. This is before the positions are paid. Some city councilors are paid, some are not. But they all have staffs, and the staffs are there to try to help you understand who can get you through a problem if you're having one, or a desire to see a park fixed up or whatever. Those are constituent services. And people are like, I've actually had people say, I didn't know I could go and ask them to do that. And it kind of makes my mouth fall open because I grew up in a political household. And that would never have occurred to me. Anyway, then when we go out of the county, we go out of the state, we go into counties. Now, what do counties do? Counties, when you hear that someone's voted in the Congress, going back to that pyramid, where the feds have voted to send money down to the states, it usually goes through their state legislature. And being in the state legislature, because a lot of the projects are so big, they extend from more than one city and sometimes more than one county, they'll parcel the money out to those entities. And in actual fact, in Texas, counties have an awful lot of effect on what happens to your life. I lived in housing for a while. It was for people that were 64 and better, and it was rent controlled, and it had the money came from the feds to work with this corporation that was running these. It was really a nice place. I mean, when I first moved in there, it was beautifully kept up. We had some sort of discouraging management for a while until they found out I knew how to get a hold of county commissioners who knew me, and they would call them up. And when you're working with an entity that is tied somehow to federal money, through county money, or through city money, you're going to find out that they sit up and pay attention. It really does work. That's how you can make your government work for you. You cannot sit there and expect them to read your mind and pay attention to you if they don't understand that you're really there. Local governments in the U.S. have had kind of an interesting way that they grew. I saw someone making comments about how different the governments are in Hawaii because they're on the islands. And some states have tribal nations in them, so they have reservation laws that also are part of the land that they're all on. All those would be lovely if all those groups work together, but they don't. So you got to realize when you're looking at what's going on around you, things happen on two tiers, and you say, well, oh my God, how am I supposed to know what tier or what does it in my county? You go to here, write this down. Ballotpedia is a computer site. It's neutral. It's neither Republican or Democrat. They keep track of every governmental thing. If you go into Ballotpedia and you type in your name and address, they will tell you every elected official that touches your lives. City, town, village, county. If you're in an unincorporated area, they'll tell you who's running that and who the things are around that. They tell you who represents you on the state level. They also tell you who represents you on a federal level. And one of the best things Ballotpedia does is it gathers up. I'm going to get rid of this one. And I'm going to put me in the middle. One of the best things Ballotpedia does is Ballotpedia keeps track of all those things. They keep track of all the laws going through all those things, including a lot of times in the local ones, they follow that up. They also follow other elected districts that are in states. School districts are within states, and they are their own little thing. And Ballotpedia keeps track of what's going on with them and watching how they're changing, watching how many seats are changing. They report during an election cycle whether incumbents are staying or whether the names you're going to face in the ballot are all new people. They also, if you go like Dallas City Council, we have term limits. So our city council people can serve for 4 terms, which is 8 years. They get elected every 2 years. Every city has a system where they either cut off the amount of time they serve or they let them stay forever, which I think is an incredibly dangerous policy. You can see it in the U.S. Congress and Senate right now. It's not working so good. And so our history's been, it grew from the small cities, from the towns and the villages, and they actually formed and they started paying taxes and hiring people, going back to the early settlements where people felt like they needed to protect their property because they were out in the woods. And let's see. Oh, there's also, I forgot, there's, besides village, there's hamlets. I don't know where they're hamlets. I've never lived there. But there's also combined areas like in Honolulu and Philadelphia, San Francisco, Nashville, and Denver have city county connections where they do things together. And so therefore they create boards to do things together. But if you go to Ballotpedia, it will tell you who's doing or not doing your roads, who's doing or not doing your sewers. And they also can create something. We have a lot of these in Texas because between Dallas and Fort Worth, it's, I think from border to border, it's 40 some miles. But we own like DFW Airport together. So we have created what's called a Council of Governments. And those entities will take care of like that giant chunk. DFW Airport is the landmass of Manhattan. It's the same acreage. And so it's a big place. And it doesn't just have a board of governors. It has this other board that goes back politically. Okay, enough about Texas. Oh, there's a thing, and it's called Dillon's Rule, and it's the Supreme Court ruling. And it says that counties can rule counties, cities can rule with inside cities. But the way the power is shared is you do it in your area. There's, in Dillon's Rule, the federal and the state can do rulings that make them co-equal. You don't find that between cities and counties. Of course, then we have crazy states like mine that try to take over cities and counties because they don't like how they vote. Um, so what happens on the state level? This is Dillon's Rule. You got your legislative branch, and they're both Congress and state have them, and state legislatures create state statutes, and federal legislatures create federal statutes. And when they butt into each other, they go to the Supreme Court. And as in today, where the state took over and said, no, we're rewriting all of the voting boundaries and the voting districts. And the Supreme Court got involved, and the Supreme Court came in and said, amazingly enough, no, you're not going to draw it that way. We're going to sending it back to you. You have to draw it so that the African Americans are not all squashed into one district. You know, it's someday, maybe if I get really inspired, I'll do a whole thing on gerrymandering. It's called cracking or packing. what they were doing in that case is they were packing. Now the Supreme Court's coming in and said, nope, you got to crack. You got to take it apart. Let them have it. Let them have a chance to really be represented in the numbers that they are proportionally within the state. So now, when you get to the governor's offices in our country, they run a lot of stuff that runs your life. They run Department of Motor Vehicles. They do your driver's license. They do insurance things. I've actually at one point had to go and ask a constituent problem from the insurance board because my insurance got cut off. And I found out that the people who put the claim in against me were a scam. There were only 2 people in the vehicle. By the time they got to their insurance claim, they claimed there were 4, and they were going to one of those chiropractic doctor's offices that was bilking everybody, and they were getting a skim off of it. And I went in and I brought in my witnesses that were there when these people, they hit my rear end, by the way. I had a guy who worked at a car dealership that was on the corner, and he stepped up and said, yeah, there were only 2 people in that car because I came over to see if you guys were okay. And we managed to get them to change the ruling. So because they had me put on where you had to go into the insurance pool, which is not a place where you want to buy your auto insurance, let me tell you. And I had not had enough accidents to even be in there. Anyway, I made a constituent claim, and the insurance board got involved, and it came out in my favor. I got put back in a favorable insurance group, and without that kind of help, I would have been stuck in nowhere with paying 3 times the amount of car insurance I should have had to pay. That's one idea. So if the state controls the service or the industry, then they have people there that provide constituent services. And if you go into Ballotpedia, they have a thing about how to access constituent services. They don't tell you how to write the letters. You got to be smart enough to know how to do that. But so when you're voting on the state level, you're voting for legislators that want to protect the public, not protect the industries. We just had 2 days ago, the Supreme Court rejected the case about when the power went off in the winter and killed all those people. They said that it couldn't be sued because it was a state agency. It wasn't a public endeavor. It wasn't a private endeavor. And that's not really true because Encore is. Because state agencies can't go bankrupt, and Encore has. But, that's our friends in the Supreme Court. What can I say? But you need to know, you kind of need to look around and say, do they control this? I talked to someone who's having problems with a bank, where the bank had not informed them of changes in their accounts and ended up running up a massive amount of charges. And that can be on the state level, depending on what the charges were about, or they can be on the federal level because the FDIC does hold sway over the banks. So sometimes you kind of have to pick which level you want to go after, if you want to go after them. Hopefully all of y'all are living good parts of your charts and swinging your pendulums to get good yes, no's, and so you're not running into any of these problems. But this is to kind of let you know where to go. So you need to look at what the state runs, what are the kinds of services, and that every state, matter of fact, the National Governors Association has a whole 11-page booklet on how to set up constituent services in your state, which I think is kind of sad because you would have thought they'd be there, but I guess all things being created equal. And then they talk about enhancing it, communicating with the public, creating regional offices for your state government so people don't have to go so far. And they talk about, doing Capital for a Day things where kids come from schools to see how the government works. I wouldn't let my kids do that if they even had the opportunity in Texas, because I know it's obscene and I don't want them to see anything that bad. Anyway, so we're going to go back to charts, I think, now. So if you're in the state, you need to know what are the services the state provides Complaining about driver's license laws to the feds isn't going to help you, because the driver's license and how it's structured is structured here in your state. But there was a thing where the federal government gave states the option. They didn't have to do it, but they could do sort of a double check on your driver's license, and it makes it easier for you to get on airplanes. I mean, so there are things like that where they work together. Um, and then constituent services on the congressional level. Okay, we're going to look at what happens in the congressional level. Okay. In the congressional level, you have the legislature, which is separated into, it's called Congress, and it's the Senate and the House of Representatives. Then you have the executive branch, which is right now Joe Biden and Kamala Harris. That tells you how old these graphics are. One's Obama, and the other one looks like Biden, but Biden certainly doesn't look like Kamala. Maybe if you switched them. And then the third branch of our government that's supposed to be co-equal is the Supreme Court. But right now, our Supreme Court, I personally thinks it's a lot more than co-equal. It thinks it can run roughshod over everybody, despite the fact they've been giving us a few good rulings, reasonable rulings recently. And so what do you do about finding out? Ballotpedia is really good about getting you information about and it's balanced information. It's not from one side or the other. And I don't work for Ballotpedia. I have never worked for them, but I tell you, I would have loved it had I could have. I had to educate sometimes I had candidates running for office who hadn't done all their homework, and they didn't know what they could really do. I mean, what sort of things they would really be voting on. And that's kind of sad, but it happens. I had some that were other ones that were so incredibly well informed, they taught me what I needed to know about what they could affect and how they could change things. So I'm going to go. Okay. Oh, we got a lot of people talking about Hawaii. So if you want, you need to know who made the rule that I'm groused about. Okay. Then you need to know, you can contact their office, and on all levels, unless they're a real schlug, in which case I'd go the next district over if I couldn't find an answer. I'd try to find someone who could help me. Sometimes I can help you with just a phone call. Sometimes it takes a letter from you and documentation from you, but it really can help you feel more empowered and feel more like what you're doing as a citizen is important. And like I said, if you go to something like a Ballotpedia, the other most valuable thing I think Ballotpedia does is everybody who runs for anything, if they run for Dallas City Council, they get a Ballotpedia questionnaire, and they ask them to answer some questions. And it's generally about what their role really is, and kind of give you some insight into who they are. When I used to run campaigns, we sweated over questionnaires, because that's where you're putting down really what you intend to do. And a lot of times it's when people show their ignorance, because they think they're being elected to handle this, and they're really being elected to handle a whole different things. If you don't like sewers and waters, and you don't like roads, and you don't like dealing with police matters, then you don't want to be in a city council. If you think you want to go hobnob with people and make decisions about people's civil rights, you don't belong in a city council. I mean, there are things you can pass. There were at one time, before the feds got in it, we had a law that allowed partners to be covered by insurance. Now you could do it that way, but that's not necessary anymore. And if you want to know who's hearing my voice, it's going to make a difference. That's where you go to Ballotpedia and you see what people's philosophy is. They also track a lot of changes in races. They the one I was looking at today was as many laws that have been voted on to take away voting rights, as many as were passed were vetoed. I mean, half of them were vetoed. Not in my state, but in other states they were. And you can go in Ballotpedia and see which states have Republican. You have like Michigan has Democratic governor, Democratic attorney general, Democratic legislature, and its Supreme Court positions are primarily run by Democrats. Oh, that's the other thing I get asked a lot about. What's the difference between a partisan race and a nonpartisan race? Well, the answer is kind of in the way it's described. Partisan means you hear the word party in the beginning, but they put a I in instead of a Y and put an SAN on it. Partisan races are races where you're assigned to a political party. That can be Republican, Democrat, Independent, Green, Libertarian, off the wall, whatever's. And so that's what partisan races are. A lot of city councils and a lot of more locally in races, school board races generally have not been partisan. You haven't had to say whether you're Republican or Democrat. And I wish they would go back to that, because for a long time, Dallas City Council was a nonpartisan race. But then we had a lot of partisan, quite honestly, Republicans came into some districts and say, well, we don't think it should be someone like that. We want one of our own. And they would push and organize out of the Republican Party to push a certain candidate. Democrats did it too. It's called self-defense. And Democrats would tend to go towards a candidate that has certain views. But theoretically, you will not see an RRD on a nonpartisan ballot. And in Texas and in most states, nonpartisan races are the races, whether it's for school board or city council, or some places, even their counties are nonpartisan. Those elections will happen in the spring. The partisan elections, the ones where you have an RRD, run in November, along with the federal races. And let's see. And if you get a good advocate out of a politician's office, it's really important. And I know a lot of people say, well, they don't ever listen to our voice. Well, I don't know how many of you were around for the ACA fight when we fought to get what they called Obamacare. Okay, I'm going to put this statement up because I think, as a retired state worker, I've seen state agencies quake with terror over constituent complaints taken to a good legislature. If they go to bat for you, they can do wonders. And that's really the truth. And it's something, because they don't teach civics anymore, people don't know I have a right to be in there. During Obamacare, what happened is, whenever a big, huge legislative session came up like that, a big item like that, they go to Republicans and they go, well, I'm not hearing it from my district. I don't know who wants this. I don't know who they are. And so a group was formed before the ACA fight even started. And they created a phone system, and you could sign up for it, and they would send you a notice and say, okay, today, call your legislator. Now, mind you, at that time, my house representative was Pete Sessions, if you don't know who he is, for entertainment purposes only, he was pretty worthless, in my opinion. And then my two senators were Cornyn and Cruz, another charming set of wonders. Anyway, but what it would happen is Pete Sessions came out one time. He said, "Well, we're just not hearing it in our office." And someone stood up in the meeting who had kept all the call logs that they had helped arrange for people to say, "Call now," and we're tracking it. And they'd say, "Congressman, we want you to look over this list because these people have said they called you." And it was an enormous number of people. And we kept that up, and that was not just in my district. It was all over the country. And that's when the Republicans realized they couldn't stand up there and lie and say, "Well, no one in my district wants this," because big insurance didn't want it. And that's one way that they get around that. I imagine some of those things will show up again. But Coltos is right. And you may be true, Karen, but if you really want to know, you can go back to that Ballotpedia and find out. They'll tell you. If you type your name in there and your address, or you can just type in your name and kind of where you live, they'll send you all the information on all the people running all the bits and pieces around you. And that just gives you a leg up. It just gives you a chance to know what's going on. And let's see if right. We've got a lot of people in Hawaii talking about Hawaii. Okay, so we've talked about states, we've talked about cities, we've talked about the federal government. The federal government also oversees our territories, and I told you what they were. And they get some representation, but not much. They pay taxes just like we do. They don't get a tax break because Trump doesn't think Puerto Rico's a state, a territory. And actually, in the last round of agreements we signed with the UN, we were supposed to make our territories states. And there's a whole lot of political pushback on why they don't want them to be. It's like DC statehood. You know, with what comes with the statehood, 2 senators. And there's a certain party that doesn't want any more senators than the ones that can control now. I think the only fight that could really pull me out of my hidey hole, if they went after the Electoral College, I'd be in there, I'd be helping organize, I'd be doing whatever I could. I think that last vestige of the patriarchy means, because it means if you're, and I don't, not that I don't like people in Wyoming, I actually have a brother who lives there, but why should they have such an inordinate amount of power when there are fewer people in Wyoming than in the counties that are surrounding me? I mean, they put, and so they'll push a lot of legislature, a lot of the legislative initiatives into those counties. And that's one of the things that causes a great imbalance. I've never liked the Electoral College. I understand exactly why it was compromised to the South. I learned that in school before I came to the South. In the South, they don't understand it's that way. But the South still thinks the Civil War, which was a civil war, is the war between the states because they were fighting for their states' rights. Don't get me started. And if you live in a large unincorporated area, I'm going to show this one. Huge areas of her state. She's in Alaska. That's why her toes are cold. They have no local government, so it defaults to the state legislature. We have large swaths of land in Texas that are, especially West Texas. There's a whole lot of nothing in West. I mean, there's cattle and there's tumbleweeds and there's people running reasonably large ranches. But as far as being a concentrated population area, not there. Same in the Rockies. There's a lot of areas in the Rockies that aren't. those areas tend to default to the state to take care of them. Um, and let's see what else. Oh, at least she admits it. She slept through civics class. You know, most of what I learned about government, I didn't learn in my classroom. Mostly I learned over the dinner table because my mother she was an immigrant from Canada, which I know most people go, they have to immigrate from there? Yes, they do. They are not born in this country. And my mother knew more about the U.S. government because she had to study it to get her citizenship, and she became very involved. And she was a Republican. She was Republican Woman of the Year a couple times in a row. I actually have one of her framed things from being Republican Woman of the Year. My original consulting firm was named after my maiden name, and that used to be hanging in the office. Um, but she was a Rockefeller Republican, which, for those of you who don't know the history, there used to be a liberal part of the Republican Party that was up in the Northeast. And when she went to go to the Miami convention that nominated Nixon, um, she uh, she went down there fully expecting to support Rockefeller. But she said it was so weird. She got there and everyone around her, and they kept snagging her and saying, "We understand you have a lot of influence in Illinois." And they knew who she was, and she didn't understand. And she admitted to me later, although she thought Nixon had every right to do what he did, because she eventually fell into the fox pit. But she admitted to me when she was younger that she'd been sidelined and brainwashed and pushed into thinking it's the only way to go. So, but my mom, I remember being a little kid and being with my mom, and people would start talking about what they were doing, and they're going, "Helen, we just can't believe you're involved in politics. Why would you want to sully your hands in politics?" And she said, "I'd rather sully my hand in politics now than have them sully their hands on me." And it was a year ago that we got to see the ultimate end of when they want to sully their hands on us. Having lived in pre-Roe America and having had all my children under Roe rules, where I had it was between me and my doctor what happened, and I had a high risk pregnancy, and I would not have gone forward with it unless I knew I could get adequate care. I can't tell you the number of women I know who had babies because they knew that even though they were at risk or the child was at risk, that they had options. And the whole idea we don't have options now just makes me ill. But I agree with my mother. I'd rather sully my hands in politics and learn about what I need to know to protect myself than wait for them to come sully their hands on me. And it's never been easier to be informed. It has never been easier to be informed. And quite honestly, I love my fellow readers, and I think they're the most wonderful people in the world. But what they don't know, I thought I was going to lose my crap when filibuster came up, because they were talking about it as if it was some law. And it's not. It's just a gentleman's agreement, and it's not very gentlemanly that they came up with. And it's caused nothing but havoc. So I'm telling you, you know, I'm not saying you have to go out and march down the street for anybody. I'm not saying you have to pick a candidate today. Um, I'm just saying that um, if you want to, learn what's going on, you can read. If you get Ballotpedia sends out, you can send out, if you want a once a weekly newsletter, you can tell them about issues that interest you, and they will send you stuff about it. They will even send it based on kind of your region where you are. Um, so yeah, this is a lady who's smart. Sharon, Voices from the Swamp. She's in Louisiana, and they are getting their voice back. And one of the things they're learning is you can't count on the mainstream media, the media that's closest to you, to be spreading the truth. That's why, personally, I'm so excited about Ballotpedia, and I've been working with their material for several years. And okay, someday I'll do a thing on gerrymandering. When I do it, actually, I did a thing on gerrymandering a couple of years ago with Sheila um, Celtic Tarot and my former business partner Sean. We did a whole thing on gerrymandering because he's still out there in the trenches fighting it. That's the only reason he can't come and do any shows with me right now, is because he's actually working on the background of a bunch of campaigns. They're really getting organized early. Yeah, the War of Northern Aggression. It's another one of those made up things. I remember when I came, um, they're close. You know, one thing I learned early on in doing politics, and even back when I was in grade school and high school, and my next door neighbor, who was a Democrat, was running for state's attorney. And I worked on his campaign, even though he was a Democrat. My mother's Republican. She voted for him too because she liked Dan. You know, what we ought to be able to do. Um, one of the things you learn to do is really count the numbers. And I've worked on campaigns where we knew just by our own door-to-door work, our field work, kind of where we really stood, and we knew um, how close it was going to be, um, and where we needed to try and improve, or we knew we'd already lost it. You usually know about a week before the campaign, and just as much as I know how to count the numbers, if I was running someone's campaign, the white Republicans that run this state can count the numbers. And I think it is this year that we change from, and it's such a stupid term, from become a majority state. In other words, there's more blacks and Hispanics. That's why they're working so hard to get them off the polls. And also, we have in the area I live in, we have a large Asian population, and they're tired of getting screwed around too. I agree with you. I don't think the mainstream media, I think it's, they don't understand how angry women really are. Yeah, a lot of other, if you're like I, if you lived in pre-Roe too. I met the women lawyers who got Roe, because Roe v. Wade was the county attorney in Dallas. That's the Wade in there, and that incident happened here. And the lawyers who won it, the women who won it, their law practices are still here. And when I was young and shiny and new kind of to the area, I met those women. Yeah, this is Sherry. Yeah, and I think some stations are trying to get better. You're better the more local you become. But like, it's, they see it, and they see it, they know what's going on. But the advertisers pay for you to have news. So in this one, after our conversations with Willow, sounds like my kind of person. I'm a night person. I cannot believe the number of people who are totally uninformed about how we're being lied to our entire lives by politicians. When you have a friend die in Vietnam on the same day that your campus is having a Stop the War rally, it sort of gets seared in your memory when you're young enough that those things happen. And let's see, I'm going to try to cut. After hours conversation, want Sherry from the swamp to call her That's in the conversation. Um, I know I've seen a lot of accounts of stolen elections. Excuse me. Mold is extremely high right now because it keeps raining and then turning to 100 degrees. Um, there's no one ever lived in a world where we thought people would be talking about stolen elections. I remember when Kennedy ran against Nixon, and I was a kid, and my mom was working the polls in Joliet. They were, uh, Chicago was a very, very, very heavily Democratic area, and it's the largest part of the state. And then the southern part, I live directly, I live in a county directly south of Chicago. And I remember my mother was just sure someday they were going to dredge the Chicago River and find out all of those Nixon votes that got thrown away in Chicago. I don't remember ever hearing that story come to fruition, but anyway, so I don't know what else I can say. We're at 51 minutes. Um, you're at the top, you're the voter. If you pay attention and if you get 3 or 4 of your closest friends or people who talk to you, I do have one more thing I'll say. When in 2016, I wasn't working actively in politics. I was sidelined because of my knees being replaced, and I was sort of recovering myself. I but I registered voters at each place where I read Tarot. I had voter registration forms out so I could get everyone who um, wanted to register could register, because Texas is a difficult state to figure out how to register into. It's not so bad if you can get on the internet, but anyway, I used to have people come in from the neighborhood around us because we were in an old East Dallas neighborhood. I remember some young people bringing in their grandmother and said, "She's a citizen." And I said, "Yeah, let her." Okay, we'll put cold toes up. Um, I said, "Sure, she can register." And so I explained. Then I got out the early voting places, and they got out their phones and they found out where the closest early voting place was. But I was doing that for months. And I made sure that every person that worked in the store was registered, because there were a lot of them that were transients and they didn't. And um, they just moved from apartment to apartment. They never knew where to go and da 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 da. And there was one woman in there and she kept asking me about it. And we even got out the sample early ballot and I went through it with her just to say, this is how it looks and this is what you'll need to know about it. And here's where you can go find out about candidates you're not sure of. Well, when the election results came in, I was reading Tarot that night and I knew something really hideous was up because I know how numbers ought to come in. They weren't coming in right. And so finally, Michael and Kyle badgered me, and they said they were servers and sommeliers at the wine bar. They said, "Oh, just do a reading on them." I don't rarely do these big readings, but I did a 7x7 reading on what was happening, and it was like a giant download. I saw everything. I saw kids in cages. I saw the diminution of rights. I saw the Supreme Court switching, which is the one that scared me the most. Um, but just I saw how hideous it was going to be, how corrupt it was going to be, how the Republicans were going to take not a large mandate and not just not a large win, try to turn it into a mandate. And there was going to be hell to pay, and I couldn't wait. I mean, I was so upset that I gathered all my cards together, and Kyle and Michael said, "What's going on?" And I said, "I think he's going to win." And they said, "Oh, no, that can't happen." I said, "Oh, yes, it can." And I gathered the deck up, and I've never done this before, but I took that deck and I put a third of it, I threw a third of it into the dumpster at the wine bar. I threw a third of it into the dumpster trash at the gas station on my way home, and I threw the last third into the dumpster by the high rise I lived in at the time. And then I crawled upstairs, um, and I went to bed. And my daughter finally, the second day, she said, "Mom, you got to get up. I mean, it's the reality. You taught me we have to live with the reality. We need to get up and do the best of this." And I said, "You didn't see what I saw." She said, "Well, ask them to bless you with blanking parts of that out so that you can get on with your life." So that's what I did. And what would happen is, for the rest of his term, about a week before he was going to do another hideous stunt, which means about every week, I got a download. This is coming. Be ready for it. 3 days later, I was working back at the vintage store, and everybody was, "Oh my God, I can't believe this happened," and blah, blah, blah. And I kept telling you guys, don't say his name. Don't talk about what he's talking about. Talk about what Hillary's talking about. Look at that side of it. And by that time, we had the numbers in. And only 48% of the eligible voters in the U.S. had voted in that election. 50 now, and somebody said, "I bet you're really pissed at those people who voted for Trump." And I said, no. They voted the way they wanted to vote, and that's what voting's about. But the people I'm pissed at are the 52% who couldn't get off their butts and just make a decision. Because, oh, Hillary's emails and all the other crap that they were letting themselves hear, and not looking at either candidate. And I have had so many people tell me in my life, "Oh, I don't vote because I don't want to be blamed for it." Trust me, if you don't vote, you're the first person I'm going to blame for it. And that's it. And and somebody said, "You sound," I said, if I could get a hold of one of them, they might have less of a lifespan than they would have had otherwise. I said, "Don't anybody talk to me about it." Well, about 4 months later, the young woman who I'd gotten to register, showed her how to vote, told her exactly where her polling place was, she came up and she said, "I need to tell you something." She said, "I didn't vote." And she said, "I heard what you said, and I don't want you to hate me." And I said, "Girl, you have no idea how bad this can get." And she said, "Oh, it won't be that bad." Well, fast forward to when COVID hit, and when they could finally open the store with masks on, I went in to pick up a check they owed me. It was one of the few times, it was the first time I'd gone out since I'd walked away from the world in mid-February 2020, and it was in May. And she was at the desk and she gave me the check, and she said, "I couldn't have imagined how bad it could get." And she had a tear running down the side of her cheek. I said, "Are you going to vote from now on? Because that's your one chance to make a difference in the whole community." And she said yes. And last time we had an election, she did vote. She called me up and said, "I just want to let you know, I've learned my lesson. I voted. I voted for Biden." So I'm just telling you guys, please. Um, you know, we just need, this is good. Always vote and help in your community to get the best outcome. I mean, pick what you think is the best outcome. And then when you vote, say for the most beneficent principles possible, and just put it out there. So if you live in a state that's one of our electoral college's nightmares, make sure you go out and vote. Last time I voted early. I got out in a parking lot where there were guys sitting in the back of a pickup on the far end of the parking lot with guns. And I thought I'd never see that in my lifetime. But one thing I'm really proud of that COVID's done, there's so many more young people showing up to help at the polls. And they're going to be our salvation. And we need to encourage them. We need to educate them. You know, you need to introduce them to Ballotpedia. There's things on there that they might be interested in. And I have voted. They changed the voting age to 21 the year I turned 21. I was really pissed when I was 18 and I couldn't vote. But it's just so, it's just such a part of me. I can't imagine it's not a part of everyone. And part of it is that people just don't know. Well, now there's no reason people shouldn't know. There's a place to go get the information and look at it, and have it sent your email and read it when you want, and don't read it when you don't want. And I hope that I helped educate you a little bit. Now I'm going to go back in my world of woo. Tomorrow I am going to discuss the creation of my oracle garden and how it relates to runes. And one of the things that when I was being told that I was going to create this thing by the guides that were telling me, I said I want it to not be able to do yes nos, because I think those are too restrictive and they already plant the outcome in our mind, and that they won't do politics. And it is so funny because when I've read with Sheila, she's got a garden, and she and I've done a couple shows of reading in the garden. I think it kind of pisses her off. You really can't read politics on it. The stones just roll off the board, which is kind of fun. I think it's fun because what we should be doing is going and looking at factual information, looking at a person's record, looking at what they write when they write out their candidate form and questionnaire. Look at it. If someone doesn't write a candidate questionnaire, it makes me wonder who they really are. And we're going to have some interesting primaries coming up. We're going to have some interesting things coming up. I think there's going to be a lot more open congressional seats than they think right now, because I think Jack Smith's not done. But that's my world of woo sense. That's nothing I know, because Jack Smith doesn't call me. I know you're shocked, but he doesn't. So I want you to all know that what this lady said, it's amazing to me. States are so different. It's been eye-opening to me. I think they've changed it in Pennsylvania, but when I was running elections in Texas, they only were allowed to vote on voting day. They had no early voting. I can't even imagine that. I mean, it's just, you really should give everyone every opportunity to vote. And actually the Republicans screwed themselves in Texas when they got rid of mail-in ballots, or so heavily restricted them, because they had spent the last 15 years educating their voters to vote by mail-in. And then they stripped it away. So they shot themselves in the foot. They've shot themselves in the foot so many times, I don't know what toes they're walking on. But anyway, we're not. We're walking ahead, and we're going to go ahead. And, I will look at the thing about gerrymandering. It's kind of interesting. And there are actions you can take when that's potentially going on. It happens once every 10 years with the census, but maybe forewarned is forearmed, or if it gets thrown back to your state, which I have a feeling it's going to get thrown back to a few more states, it'll give you another shot at being there. And I want to have a shot at, I got an indoor herb garden that's in a big stand, and you can actually grow little tomato plants in it. And I got to set that up today. That's my job for the day for me. So y'all go take care of your lives. I'm not going outside because it's 100 degrees, and I don't do 100 degrees. I just live where it does 100 degrees. And I hope I informed you a little bit. And I really appreciate all the new people who've shown up. I see a lot of different names that I'm not used to. And thank y'all for being here. Wait a minute. One thing. And I did have one lady who asked me a question about, let's see, and I forgot to go to her question. Oh, yeah. Okay. She asked if local governments and board of supervisors and things can vote for things for the wealthy and leave other people out in the dust. And yeah, they can. And how do you know about it? You have to kind of go to meetings. And I mean, that sounds boring as hell, but actually sometimes they're not. They can vote in, especially we have gated communities in Dallas. And so up until the time the gate goes up, finally we had some people who said, well, if you want a gated community, then those are your roads. So they do take care of their own roads. But they can vote in gated communities and things like that. So, yes, you can. When you that's why you need to know who's elected, how they're elected. And if nothing else, the way I met Valletta Lil, I just called her up one day and I said, I'm one of your constituents. I'd like to talk to you. And I was president of a homeowners association, brought in several issues. She and I got to be good friends, and she kind of guided me around, and she got me back into being actively in politics here. So that's the end of the broadcast. Y'all take care. Please go to Ballotpedia, and I will talk to you later. Bye. I keep forgetting.